When we turn back the hands of time, aviation has always found a way to leave us in awe. But in the late 1920s, it birthed a monster so massive that even today it holds the title of the largest land biplane ever built. This beast wasn't just big, it was versatile. It could transform from a land plane to a seaplane, and from a military aircraft to a commercial giant. If anything, it was pulling off Transformer-level tricks long before we even imagined Autobots. But what happened to this engineering marvel? How did it make history? And how was it so successful that it ultimately failed? Stay tuned to find out. To truly understand the story behind the Caproni Ca.90, we first need to have a look at this man, Giovanni Battista Caproni. Picture this, it's the early 20th century and aviation is still in its rebellious teenager phase. Planes are getting bigger, crazier, and sometimes downright bizarre. This was the era that gave us the Flying Coffin, the Blackburn RB-2 Sydney, Poland's Bison, the PZL-30 Zuber, the Soviet Sky Fortress Kalinin K-7, and the aerodynamically flawed French Brick, the Bernard 191 GR. The whole world seemed to have gone mad, but no one was as insanely creative as the designers in Italy. And leading the charge, a man who had a love affair with colossal aircraft, Giovanni Battista Caproni. This guy wasn't just another aircraft designer. No, Caproni had one mission: to build the biggest, boldest, most over-the-top planes ever. His philosophy was simple. If it didn't look like a flying battleship, was it even worth making? His company, Caproni, rolled out the CA series, which included everything from nimble fighters to bombers so big they look like airborne buildings. But Caproni didn't stop at the practical. He built the Caproni Ca.60 Novi Plano, a 9-winged monstrosity that looked more like a stack of lasagna than an actual plane. Spoiler alert, it crashed almost immediately, yet setbacks didn't faze him. He kept churning out massive bombers like the Ca.79, Ca.80, and Ca.85, each pushing the limits of what was possible. These weren't just aircraft, they were flying fortresses designed to dominate the skies before strategic bombing was even a thing. I mean, just look at the Ca.60. But nothing compares to the Caproni Ca.90, the absolute king of the giants. This thing was so absurdly massive that even today it holds the record as the largest land-based biplane ever built. It was the ultimate expression of Caproni's obsession with big bombers. But here's the catch. For some reason, this record-breaking beast ended up as a footnote in history. And to make matters worse, it was so successful that it ultimately failed. As mentioned, the Caproni Ca.90 was not just another aircraft, it was a statement, a massive towering example of Giovanni Caproni's obsession with pushing the limits of aviation, especially in the realm of bombers. Built in the late 1920s, this machine was so enormous it almost seemed impractical, yet it showcased the full extent of what was possible with contemporary technology. For one, the materials used in its construction were typical for the time, executed on a far grander scale. The fuselage was built with a combination of steel tubing and wood, with canvas stretched over key sections. This mix maintained structural integrity without becoming overwhelmingly heavy, though the final product was still one of the heaviest aircraft of its era. Talking about size, the fuselage itself was a massive rectangular structure that reminded you of a railway carriage that had somehow sprouted wings. There was nothing sleek or aerodynamic about the plane. The design prioritized durability and function over finesse. Unlike the streamlined bombers of later decades, the Ca.90 was a brute force approach to airborne warfare. It was so massive that fueling the beast was a challenge in its own. With 6 engines to feed, fuel storage was a major consideration. To solve this, the tanks were built into the fuselage, adding to its already bulky frame. Refueling operations would have been a logistical headache, requiring careful planning to ensure the aircraft could sustain long-distance flights without becoming a liability mid-air. Given its sheer size and the technology of the time, fuel efficiency was an afterthought. Keeping this machine aloft was the priority no matter what. Then there were the wings, and if anything about the Caproni Ca.90 was truly outrageous, it was them. The aircraft was a biplane, but calling these mere wings would be an understatement. These were vast, sprawling surfaces that resembled the scaffolding of a bridge more than the delicate, aerodynamically refined wings of later aircraft. With a wingspan of 50.9 meters, it was wider than a modern Boeing 737. At this size, how did it stand? The wings were supported by an intricate web of struts and wires, reinforcing their structure but also contributing to the aircraft's bulky aesthetic. Every part of this aircraft exuded massiveness, as if it were shouting Caproni's vision of building the biggest, most powerful bombers the world had ever seen. To fully grasp the size of this aircraft, consider this. The fuselage alone was 23.45 meters long, roughly equivalent to 2 city buses parked end to end. The total height of the aircraft was 9.5 meters, making it as tall as a 3-story building. With an empty weight of 11,000 kilograms, this was not merely an aircraft, it was a flying fortress. And yet, despite or perhaps because of its impressive dimensions and capabilities, the Caproni Ca.90 performed. The Caproni Ca.90 was as much a spectacle in performance as it was in design. This bomber was built for sheer brute force, and while it never saw combat, its capabilities were nothing short of staggering. With 6 Isotta Francini ESO 1000 W18 water-cooled engines, each pumping out 1,000 horsepower, the aircraft generated a total of 6,000 horsepower, an absurd amount for its time. Yet despite this raw power, the Ca.90 was never about speed. It was designed for endurance, payload, and sheer size, not for agile maneuvering. Crazily enough, flying this monster was a surprisingly simple affair, at least in terms of crew. Unlike many bombers of its era that required multiple pilots working in tandem, the Ca.90 was designed to be controlled by a single pilot. Its control surfaces were balanced and engineered to require minimal input, allowing one person to handle the plane. However, that didn't mean it was easy to fly. It was still a massive aircraft with sluggish responses demanding precise and deliberate handling. The full crew complement included gunners, a navigator, a radio operator, and an engineer to monitor the 6 engines in flight. And yes, we said gunner for defense. The Ca.90 was bristling with firepower. It carried multiple machine guns mounted in strategic positions, including the nose, dorsal, and ventral turrets, ensuring that any attacking aircraft would face a wall of bullets. While it was slow, it wasn't defenseless. Any fighter attempting to engage it had to be extremely cautious. Besides its armaments, the plane's weight was another defining characteristic. Empty, the Ca.90 weighed around 11,000 kilograms or 24,250 pounds. But when fully loaded, it tipped the scales at over 19,000 kilograms or 42,000 pounds. To make things crazier, it could carry a payload of 8,000 kilograms or 17,600 pounds of bombs, unheard of at the time. The bomber could rival early World War II heavy bombers, over a decade before they even existed. Moving on to speed, anyone familiar with the Ca.90 would tell you that speed was never its strong suit. It had a maximum speed of 210 kilometers or 130 miles per hour, which, while respectable for such a massive plane, was far from fast. Its landing speed was a sluggish 100 kilometers per hour, 62 miles per hour, meaning that safely landing it required long, smooth runways and careful handling. Its operational range was estimated at around 1,200 kilometers or 750 miles, making it a capable long-range bomber for its time. But perhaps the most defining aspect of flying this aircraft was the feeling of commanding something truly gigantic. Pilots described it as less a plane and more a flying battleship, slow, steady, and imposing. Its first flight in 1929 was an event watched with bated breath. Pilot Domenico Antonini, who took it up, remarked on its stability, but also on its sheer size, which made it feel less like a bomber and more like a flying fortress. Antonini continued as the primary test pilot throughout the aircraft's development, demonstrating its handling characteristics and setting multiple world records with it. And perhaps one of its most amazing feats occurred on February 22, 1930. On that day, test pilot Antonini set 6 world records with the Ca-90, including reaching an altitude of 3,231 meters, or 10,600 feet, while carrying a 10,000 kilogram or 22,000 pound payload. Now, here's where things get even crazier. The Caproni Ca-90 wasn't just a bomber, it was a transformer, a shape-shifting beast that could be adapted for different roles. Caproni designed it to be converted from a land-based bomber into a seaplane by swapping its conventional landing gear for massive floats. In fact, this design concept gave rise to the Ca-91, a seaplane version built on the same over-the-top design philosophy. The idea was simple. A bomber of this size could operate from water, eliminating the need for long airstrips. It could take off from lakes, coastal bases, or even the open ocean. The transition from land to sea wasn't just a gimmick, it was a serious attempt to create a long-range bomber capable of reaching enemy territories without relying on land-based airfields. Beyond military use, Caproni also saw potential for the Ca-90 in commercial aviation. It was so massive that it could theoretically be converted into a passenger or cargo aircraft, capable of carrying people and goods across continents. Given the scale of early aviation, this was an ambitious vision. But in the era of airships, Caproni believed there was room for an airplane that could perform the same job with greater efficiency. At this point, there was no hiding it. This plane was a beast. The only problem was that only one was ever produced, and no one wanted to add a beast like it to their commercial or military ranks. But why? Well, the answer was a mix of timing and politics for the Ca-90. Its success as an engineering marvel became its downfall. And it was all because of the Great Depression. You see, the Great Depression crushed the aviation industry, and governments had little money to spend on experimental bombers. To make matters worse, Italy, already struggling with military budgets, showed no interest in mass producing it. The United States and European countries examined the Ca-90, but weren't ready to invest in such an unproven concept during an economic crisis. So, in the end, despite its impressive performance, the aircraft was simply too large, too costly, and too ahead of its time. But here's the even sadder part. Even if the economy had been stable, politics would have sealed its fate. Italian military doctrine in the late 1920s and early 1930s was skeptical of strategic bombing, favoring smaller, faster aircraft for tactical strikes. There was no faith that massive bombers like the Ca-90 could be the future of warfare. With no military backing and no civilian buyers, only one was ever built. It was the victim of timing, bureaucracy, and a lack of vision, an aircraft too ambitious for the world it was born into. And that's the story of the Caproni Ca-90, the colossal biplane that dared to defy convention. From its towering wingspan to its brute force approach to flight, it was a true behemoth of the skies. But in a world moving towards sleeker, faster monoplanes, its moment of glory was brief. Still, the Ca-90 remains a testament to the era when bigger meant better, and aviation pioneers weren't afraid to push the limits of what was possible. And this is just one chapter in the wild history of aviation. Stay tuned, because next time we'll take off into another incredible story of the machines that ruled the skies, one flight at a time. Until then, keep your engines roaring and your sights set on the horizon.